Hello and welcome to the very first episode of You Don't Know Jack, an HHN fancast. I'm your host, Nick. This fancast, which is not affiliated with Universal's Halloween Horror Nights in any way, aims to explore the story of the previous and upcoming years, as well as speculation on upcoming houses, zones, and everything to do with the greatest horror event of all time. Today on our pilot episode, we take a look back at the previous year as we build excitement for the future. After all, it's never too early to get excited for HHN. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy the fog of Universal Orlando's Halloween Horror Nights 33. Halloween Horror Nights 33 was definitely a mixed bag to say the least, with some behind-the-scenes chaos on the creative side, as well as budget restrictions due to the upcoming deadline of Epic Universe and lackluster shoehorned icons. It was obvious to see that this was not the best year in the event's long history. However, that doesn't mean there weren't highlights and memorable houses to make this event stand out. Indeed, there were low lows at HHN 33, but there were also high highs, including what I believe to be one of the scariest houses in the history of HHN. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start off this trip down memory lane at the front entrance as we enter the fog and walk through the scare zones of HHN 33. Immediately after heading through the turnstiles, we are thrown into the first zone, which honestly shouldn't even be considered a zone anymore. Duality of Fear. Our introduction to this year's icons where we choose our path, the physical pain and brutality of Sinister or the mental torment of Surreal. Whatever path you choose, you are sure to be crippled with fear. At least that's what Universal would have you believe. In actuality, Sinister and Surreal felt like poor excuses for not having the icon Fear hosting this event, which was actually believed to be the plan behind the scenes, but was changed at the last minute. The two were difficult to understand with their digitally altered voices and did a poor job of hosting and making you feel like your decisions actually mattered. In this zone especially, instead of being in the crowd, they were up on the high catwalk above your heads, talking about things no one could understand as their voices were screechy and muffled. The zone was in a very small area, which we have come to expect from this event since the Minions took over that main street. But other than fog and projections on the ground of Sinister and Surreal symbols, which, by the way, was the number 33 in an oddly connected design, there was nothing to make this feel like an actual zone. The one highlight being this was the domain of this year's Chainsaw Drill Team, a staple of the event ever since 1993, where they appeared at Halloween Horror Nights 3. But having them only in this zone felt very disappointing, as some of the most fun with them in previous years is coming across them when you least expect it. Having them only at the front took away the surprise and really made the chainsaws feel like less of a draw than ever before. But don't worry, we are just getting started with the disappointment that was the scare zones. Let's take a right down Surreal's path and enter Demon Queens. Demon Queens was the domain of Surreal, and very surprisingly ended up winning this event's Scare Zone of the Year. In my opinion, this was a far cry from what HHN Scare Zone should offer. The idea behind this zone was that we had now entered the domain of Surreal, and with the help of her Demon Queens and Acolytes, she was going to enter our minds, discovering our deepest, darkest fears and turning them against us. However, this concept proved to be nothing more than the occasional show scene of the Queens joining Surreal on a parade float in the center of the zone. While some of the interactions with Surreal could be fun, this zone was more confusing than anything. It ended up using a lot of recycled costumes and didn't really utilize the space it was afforded. We also came across many scare actors breaking character in this area, fully having conversations with each other or interacting with guests in an inappropriate manner. While the aesthetic was okay, especially at night with full fog and purple lights, this zone felt very forgettable and not at all the mental torment that was promised, unless you count boredom. Coming up next on our stroll through the scare zones of Halloween Horror Nights 33 is what I consider to be the worst, most disappointing zone of the year, Swamp of the Undead. In what many fans simply refer to as the Florida Simulator, Swamp of the Undead told the story of Backwater, Louisiana, where swamp zombies born of trespassers who were killed and had their bodies dumped in a nearby bog would come to torment you. I use the term torment loosely, as they would mostly just hang out along the sides of the walkway, as there was barely enough room to walk at all. Also, for Central Park, there was an extreme lack of set pieces, something that is a common theme in zones this year and is likely due to budget cuts because of Epic Universe working to make their opening date. Nonetheless, there weren't even decorations in the trees, which has become a standard expectation for this zone. Overall, it just felt very bland and more thrown together than anything else, especially compared to the excellence that has taken up this same space in recent years. Our next stop on this loop of the park brings us to a somewhat divisive scare zone. Enter the Blumhouse. This zone essentially served as a greatest hits of the past Blumhouse features in HHN, or in other words, a recycling of Blumhouse costumes from the previous years. However, despite the lazy execution, lack of sets, and minimal scare actors, if you are a fan of Blumhouse movies, there were actually a few things to enjoy. Seeing the characters on pedestals was a fun addition and allowed guests to get some great photo moments. This had the unfortunate downside of overcrowding and making it difficult to walk through the zone at all, especially when Megan was out. But I honestly didn't hate this zone. It wasn't great by any means, but being a fan of the black phone, seeing the grabber was fun. Finally, the last scare zone we have to talk about before moving on to the houses for this year, Torture Fair. Taking place in the year 2024, this Ren Fair adjacent festival known as a torture fair was a place for people to come dressed in time period clothing to celebrate and explore torture devices from the medieval time period. But these guests were in for a surprise to find out that the devices were real and they were about to be used to claim all new victims. This zone, in my opinion, was the best that HHN 33 had to offer. This was the domain of Sinister, and she could be seen walking and interacting with guests throughout the night. I still found her incredibly annoying and once again a sad replacement for the icon Fear, but it was cool if you were a fan of her or if this was your first time visiting Halloween Horror Nights. The zone itself had the most sets and props by a long shot. Gore-covered torture devices littered the streets and scare actors dressed in period costumes were there to torment you from multiple angles. The plague doctors in particular were a favorite of the zone, however, while certainly the best zone of the year, it was far from perfect. Compared to years before, it felt somewhat empty, lacking in volume of scare actors, use of chainsaws, no projections, and some honestly poor performances from performers. This was another zone where you could frequently find scare actors breaking character to simply hang out and chat with each other, which would quickly pull you out of the experience. That being said, this was a zone I always made sure to walk through every night. Not amazing, but certainly a lot better than anything else this year had to offer. And now, for the moment we've all been waiting for, let's talk about the houses of Halloween Horror Nights 33. Now, when it comes to the houses, we are going to do things a little bit different. Instead of going through the park as if we were walking through, I will be listing the houses in order from worst to best in my opinion. Keep in mind, this is only my opinion, and just because something is lower on my list doesn't mean others can't enjoy it. However, speaking as someone who has been a longtime fan and participant of Halloween Horror Nights, I am bound to make comparisons to previous years, and while there are some very impressive houses this year, there are also some that I feel rival the worst of all time. High highs and low lows, so let's not waste any more time and dive into breaking down my thoughts on every single house. Starting off with what I feel was the worst, most disappointing house of the year, Universal Monsters Eternal Bloodlines. Ah yes, Eternal Bloodlines, so much potential completely wasted. This house focused on the story of the daughter of the daughter of the daughter of Van Helsing, who is trying to avenge her family by hunting down Dracula's daughter, I think, among other monsters. She eventually aligns herself with the Bride of Frankenstein, only to be killed by the Wolf Woman? This house was just terrible. Universal Monsters has become a staple of Halloween Horror Nights. Known for lavish sets, interesting stories, beautiful creature design, the use of classic monsters, and terrifying scares. This house had none of that. Clearly meant to try and entice a very specific audience, Eternal Bloodlines failed at every turn. While the story could have been good if executed properly, the house just felt like repeating rooms over and over. The female protagonist was portrayed to be extremely foolish and weak, and the monsters had no scare factor to them whatsoever. Part of this may have been due to show direction instructing the scare actors not to jump out and get into the face of guests, but there was nothing to be afraid of in this house. If a scare actor did happen to hit their trigger, which was a rare feat for Eternal Bloodlines, they wouldn't come anywhere near guests and had a complete lack of energy. Bad scare acting and bad storytelling. The one redeeming quality was Dracula's house, which we got to enter for a brief scene. But outside of that, Universal Monsters Eternal Bloodlines simply felt lazy and was truly a waste of time. Hopefully, the next Universal Monsters house will learn from this year's mistakes and bring the expectations back to the highs we have experienced from these houses in years past. Up next on our house tour comes the second worst house of the year, Triplets of Terror. The story of this house introduces us to the Barmy family home on March 3rd, 1984, during the Barmy triplets' 9th birthday party where they had just slaughtered their family. The serial killer triplets Melody, Harmony, and Junior recreate their family's murder every 10 years. Picking up in 2024, we meet the triplets as they prepare to kill and recreate the murder scene once again in Cradleton, Pennsylvania. This would be impossible to know without looking it up. This house was meant to be a replacement to the yearly IP slasher houses by creating an original slasher story specifically for HHN 33. While it's not a bad concept and there are some well-executed moments throughout the house, it was extremely confusing without knowing the backstory going in, and the house itself ended up feeling somewhat boring. Since it's meant to tell the story of the triplets, you get the same 3 scares over and over and over in each room. The redeeming qualities for me personally were the opening scene facade, which saw a police cruiser and rain as you made your way into the Barmy family home. On the way through the house, there were some great nods to this year's event as a whole, and even a room set up to be a true crime podcast. Definitely some interesting ideas here, but like in Eternal Bloodlines, the execution just wasn't there. This would honestly make a much better Blumhouse movie than an actual HHN house. On to house number 8 for those of you keeping track, the Museum Deadly Exhibits. The Museum of International Folklore are preparing to set up for their latest exhibit, the Rotting Stone. But many of the employees of the museum soon begin to realize that the artifact corrupts and possesses inanimate objects and wreaks havoc across the museum and its other exhibits. A house that certainly sounded very promising and not unlike Night at the Museum with a horror twist ended up being quite a disappointment. For the first time ever, the queue for this house wound through the queue for the Simpsons ride, which was certainly an odd feeling. But once you entered the house, things only got worse. If there is one thing that an HHN house should not be, it's boring. And that's exactly what this house was. While the concept had lots of potential and an interesting story setup, we once again come across a problem of poor execution. Staffing issues truly plagued this house, as it wasn't until halfway through the season I finally saw this house filled with scare actors. Also, for the concept of a museum coming to life, placing this house in a tent made everything feel way too small. In addition, the scary rock, which was supposed to be the thing making everything in the museum come to life, looked extremely silly. Think of a giant brown marshmallow man. It would mutate and grow through the house, but honestly just made me giggle instead of feel any actual fear. This house was not without a couple of highlights, however. Keeping it off the very bottom of the list are the Viking scene, in which wonderful projection and practical effects mixed together to give you the feeling of being on a Viking ship, some nice overall details in the design of the architecture inside the house, as well as this house being the home of the iconic HHN bear this year. It was sadly only a statue, but at least that's better than nothing. With that, we are finally transitioning out of the total stinkers into the more middle-of-the-road experiences. Houses that had enough of an intrigue and enjoyment factor to keep them out of the bottom, but also lacked that extra something special to place them among the elite. We start off with a house I honestly expected to be higher on this list. Ranking in at number 7 is A Quiet Place. A Quiet Place would be based on both the first and second films in the series, aiming to tell the story in a unique and more immersive way than ever before. Right from the announcement of this house, speculation of what this would actually entail ran rampant. How would they adapt a film where the concept is that you have to remain silent at an event that has constant sounds of up to 90 decibels both in the streets and in their houses? We would get some of our answers through the official Universal HHN podcast, where they would tease that this particular house was very experimental. It would be quiet, and your experience would depend on if your group made noise or not. You, the guest, would play a role in how your walkthrough of this house would go. At least, that's what they led us to believe. In actuality, this house was not that much different or unique from other IP houses we've had in years before. Granted, the design was beautiful. Sets felt like they were taken straight from the screen, and the creature design was very impressive. While sound was not as groundbreaking as we originally led to believe, it still played a factor and offered a fairly tense house through the use of ambient noise. 2 scenes in particular that still stick in my mind are the safe room scene, where there was an incredible illusion of a creature emerging from underwater, as well as the dock scene, which used darkness and sound to make you feel like you stepped outside into a space that was much larger than it actually was. On top of this, we were promised the use of ASL throughout the house, which didn't really happen. There were about 3 moments of this if you were lucky enough to see them, and they were extremely simple signs with lots of pointing. The unique crutch of this house, however, was the puppets used to portray the creatures known as death angels. The details in the design of these puppets was very impressive, but led to a hindrance in that the vast majority of scares were puppets that had very limited range for movement. This resulted in the very first run-through of the house feeling somewhat impressive, but subsequent run-throughs would quickly feel lackluster and repetitive. It was interesting and pretty, but it just wasn't scary. The amount of stiff puppets led to the house lacking a feeling of life, and I would honestly find myself bored and not really wanting to return to this house as the season went on. Not a bad house, but certainly not anywhere close to the best of the year or previous years. Continuing on, we approach house number 6 on our list, Monstruos, Monsters of Latin America. Monstruos was fine. With El Muerte as your guide, you would journey through the environments of Latin America and come across 3 terrifying creatures whose names I'm about to butcher. They were Tlahuapuchi, La Lechuza, and El Cebon. This was an interesting house, as it would have moments of excellence, but lacked that special something to really elevate it to its full potential. Don't get me wrong, there were nights where I would consider this house an underrated gem, but there were also nights it just missed the mark. The main reason for this was the scare actors, in particular, their staffing. If you were lucky enough to go through this house with a full cast, you were in for a terrifying treat. The creature designs were good enough, but the scare actors really did a wonderful job of bringing them to life. Lots of gory, brutal scenes played host to the creatures screaming and getting in the face of guests, including one brilliant scare that saw La Lechuza on stilts that, when timed correctly, would set you up for a brutal scare around the corner. This house actually played host to 2 stilt scares, both of which were excellent and the perfect amount of puppets. One puppet in particular that could make people fall to the ground in fear. Where this house falls short of making it into the top 5 is the overall design. While not bad, the set itself feels a little bland. It's meant to be taking you through various environments of Latin America, but it falls flat and doesn't really deliver that immersive experience one would hope for from an HHN house. This may have been due to the fact that it was sharing a soundstage with Ghostbusters, which required large set pieces. But even if this is the case, previous years have executed this scenario to much greater success. Aside from the scare actors, there wasn't really a lot to look at. Walls fell flat and rooms seemed to lack any real detail. As a result, if you had the misfortune of attending during a night with low attendance or simply with scare actors choosing not to hit their triggers, it could make for a boring walkthrough outside of the puppets, which, I cannot stress enough, were stunning. This house was the perfect balance of puppets and scare actors, but it was too reliant on those crutches and really lacked in the set design department. This would not be an issue for the next house on our list. We now enter the top 5 houses of Halloween Horror Nights 33. In the 5th spot, just beating out Monstruos, Monsters of Latin America, is Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire at the start of the season felt like one of the worst houses of the year. However, that quickly changed as time went on. Initial issues of lacking scare actors and just scares in general quickly changed. Staffing issues and scare actor performance proved to be the culprit, as one cast seemed significantly more enthusiastic than the other. The use of stilts throughout was fantastic. The use of the source material combined with nods to both the original movie and house were fantastic. And the use of puppets was perfect. Combine this with the one aspect that was strong from the beginning, the set design, and you have the makings of a great house. By the end of the season, there were still some things that could have been improved, the use of the Ghostbusters theme song being one of them. Don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic song to hear while exiting the house, but I feel it would have been better to have the song blaring throughout the house from start to finish. I understand that would remove some tension, but to be honest, this house's other critique was that it was never really scary. Occasionally, a well-timed trigger would surprise and scare some guests, but the overall feel of the house just was not scary. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire would go down as one of the most beautiful houses of the year. While there were multiple gorgeous set pieces, one in particular that stood out was the firehouse scene. After exiting tight corridors of darkness, the house opened up to a truly stunning exterior setup. The Ghostbusters firehouse in all of its glory towered above guests, with snow falling down and projections selling the illusion that ice was overtaking the building. There was also a projection of Slimer roaming through the windows for lucky guests to see if they timed it just right. As you take in this sight in front of you, hidden around the corner to the right was a perfectly placed stilt scare before entering the firehouse itself. This was my surprise house of the year. I started off hating it, but by the end of the season, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire made it into my top 5. Just goes to show you how much can change over the course of the event. We've arrived at the number 4 spot, and occupying that space is Major Sweet's Candy Factory. Flip your lids, kids. Come on, chaperones, you'd better get inside before the kids eat all the free samples. What started out as a scare zone at HHN 31 was now a full-fledged haunted house. Serving as a prequel to the scare zone, Major Sweets puts you in the shoes of school chaperones on a tour of Major Sweets Candy Factory. Things quickly take a turn as the candy turns children into sugar-fueled fiends, making them attack and murder the adults in some very gruesome ways. This house honestly feels like one of the most underrated of the year, which is wild to say considering the popularity of the zone before it. However, Major Sweets delivered once again, this time giving us a more detailed story and diving into the characters that we only caught glimpses of previously. This house did a wonderful job of storytelling while also becoming the gore house of the year. While perhaps not as gruesome as the houses of previous years, Major Sweet's Candy Factory had plenty of bloody, gory, mangled body goodness. Truly, the amount of intestines weaved throughout the house was a sight to behold. There were even intestines dangling from the top of a trash compactor at the end of the house, which guests had to walk through, but this was quickly scrapped after the first couple of weeks, likely due to guests pulling them down and breaking them. Speaking of guests touching things, this house also played host to plenty of interactable elements. Various buttons would cause puffs of air and water to spray onto guests as well as make certain elements move. Specifically, one giant rat toward the back half of the house right before the Jawbreaker victim, which, by the way, was one of the most hilarious and ironic victims I've ever seen in a house. There was also a hidden interactive element in the second room of the house. On Major Sweet's desk was a small bowl of candy which invited guests to take one. If you did, you would be hit with a strong puff of air, just enough to startle you before getting deep into the gruesome festivities. We also cannot move on from this house without acknowledging the fantastic soundtrack. A collection of upbeat swing and pop music from the 1950s perfectly sets the tone for this fantastically fun house. What keeps this house out of the top 3 are only 2 detractors. The first one being this house needed to be in a soundstage. While fantastic things can be done in tents, this particular house would have been much better served with the space of a soundstage to make it feel a bit more like a large candy factory. While they did an excellent job with the space provided, everything just felt a little too small and crammed. It would have greatly benefited to give the candy factory the space it deserves, and likely would have elevated the entire experience. The second is mistreats, or, to be specific, the mistreat scare actors. Poor scare actors is a running theme this season, and while the rest of this house had fantastic performers, mistreats in particular was noticeably bad. Rarely hitting triggers and never really getting into the role felt like a huge detractor, as the character is very crucial to the story of the house. Hopefully, this is a standard that will be raised in the future, as this was not the only house with poor scare actors, but it was very noticeable here simply due to how prominent mistreats was throughout the house. However, all things considered, Major Sweet's Candy Factory continued to be an extremely enjoyable house night after night. We have now officially reached the top 3 houses of Halloween Horror Nights 33. Normally, the top 3 houses of the year tend to just barely take that spot for having some sort of extra wow factor to them. However, this year, these top 3 houses stand far above the rest. For a year that could honestly be looked back on as mediocre, these houses stood above the rest and truly made for unforgettable moments. So much so that it almost feels like they belong to better years and were somehow pulled into this year's event. These 3 houses were the reason to have frequent fear. Multiple runs a night always left you wanting to return to experience what these 3 houses had in store. Starting off our podium of excellence at number 3 is Goblin's Feast. This house was phenomenal. This was clearly meant to be the fun house of the year, and it succeeded in every aspect. While other houses like Major Sweets or Ghostbusters had elements of Goblin's Feast within them, this house was executed perfectly every step of the way. The story of this house was that you were being welcomed into the Goblin's Feast Tavern and Village, where an annual massive feast was being prepared for goblins, orcs, witches, giants, and more fantastical creatures. but you would soon discover that you are the main course. The fun tone of this house was established immediately, entering through a beautiful tavern facade that had a Goblin's Pub banner covering a sign that said Human Chop House. Irish jig music would be playing as you were welcomed into the feast. Something that finally elevates this house as opposed to the previous ones were the scare actors. Everyone felt so invested in their roles, firing triggers consistently, which allowed guests to hear hilarious and fun lines from all of the different characters and creatures inside. One of the funniest being the goblin at the very end who bore a stunning resemblance to Preminger from Barbie Princess and the Pauper, who would yell out that the food was escaping. Another major highlight of Goblin's Feast was the set design. It very wisely used a technique that Blood Moon did in the year prior to establish a large and authentic feeling environment by allowing you to see into the town setting that you would later walk through from the beginning of the house. Essentially, if you looked through a window in the first room, you would see the goblin village that you would later visit. And if you were in the goblin village and looked back toward where the window was, you could see the full tavern at what felt like a greater distance than before. Another stunning set piece was right before you entered the human dungeons. After clearing the forest, you came up to what appeared to be a massive statue, and if you let your eyes follow it up, you would see a full-blown castle with a drawbridge above you to truly sell the illusion that you were entering the dungeon level of a castle. The statue even doubled as a boo hole for scare actors. Through using forced perspective combined with small details like this, it allowed for Goblin's Feast to feel massive and open even though it was inside of a tent. To top it all off, there was even a beautiful massive puppet at the end of the house that served as a distraction for one final scare. This house was perfect. It accomplished its goal of being the comedy house. It was beautiful to walk through, fantastic costume design, entertaining scare actors, the right amount of gore, and a few good scares to keep your heart pumping. We have reached the top two, and honestly, these two were so close in quality that you could basically swap either of them into the number one spot and they would both be deserving. Two houses of pure excellence that made having frequent fear worth it. Two houses I could not get enough of. Two houses that stood out in a year of mediocrity. However, only one of these two houses caused so much fear and anxiety that it would truly terrify even the most grizzled of HHN goers. This is what makes the difference between the 1 and 2 spot. While the number 1 house was definitely the scariest I have ever personally been through, the house that takes the number 2 spot was truly my favorite of the year. That number 2 slot goes to somewhat fittingly the only sequel house of the year, Slaughter Cinema 2. This was by far the house I was looking forward to the most in the days leading up to HHN 33, as I was a huge fan of the original Slaughter Cinema house, and this one did not disappoint in the slightest. Everything about this house was executed perfectly. However, one of the coolest, most unique aspects began outside of the house in the queue. Just like the original Slaughter Cinema 2 takes place at a drive-in movie theater where we will step into the newest B-movie horror trailers. This story is taken to the next level as before you enter there is a giant drive-in movie screen with period-accurate cars lined up perfectly outside. The screen itself is playing the super fun, cheesy, and original movie trailers for guests to see in order to build up excitement and immerse them in the story of this house. This works to perfection as it makes the queue feel much more tolerable, even though this year the sound seemed to be a little more quiet as there were not as many speakers lining the queue. Nevertheless, every trailer was so much fun to watch, I even witnessed guests at the end of the night standing outside of the house and just watching the trailers. They did a perfect job of showcasing exactly what you were about to see upon entering the house. Inside, the house could not have been more organized. Movie posters were displayed along the walls of short transition areas with an old-school theater announcer introducing the film before you would walk through it. The detail in each room was incredible, especially considering each movie had only one room to tell its story. Some of my personal favorites were Killer Kringles, a perfect Christmas-themed room that felt even more perfect on those November days, Blood and Chum, which had a fantastic underwater illusion complete with a massive shark puppet that looked phenomenal, and Zyborgs, undead cyborg monsters jumping out at you. While their costumes were great, the real beauty here was the set. You truly felt like you were in the trenches of a future war not too dissimilar to The Terminator, with blood dripping down the wall, explosions happening around you, and lasers zipping above your head. Add on to this fantastic sound design and it truly created a breathtaking experience. This house also played host to what many dubbed as the unofficial icon of the event, the character on all the merchandise, a mohawk-wearing skeleton from the B-movie entitled Heavy Metal Hell 3D. This house truly had everything you could ask for. Stunning set design, great scares, varied and immersive locations, a perfectly told and clear story, and just a fantastically fun vibe. I personally went through this house 40 times over 35 visits. It never got old and was a house I needed to visit every single night. It was perfect and definitely my favorite of the year. However, the top spot belongs to a different house. For sheer execution of concept, set design, and for being the scariest house I have ever been through. I'm sure you know what it is by now, and to be honest, was there ever any doubt? The house of the year, Insidious the Further. For the first time since Halloween Horror Nights 25, the Insidious franchise would be returning to haunt guests once again, this time serving as a greatest hits for the entire franchise, including the newest film, Insidious the Red Door. Insidious the Further would take guests through the Red Door and into the Further, where time works differently, allowing guests to experience some of the most terrifying scenes and characters from the franchise's long history, with the main antagonist being the dreaded red-faced demon. Hopes were very high after the success of Insidious back in HHN 25, with many wondering if the franchise would ever return to the event and if it could live up to the house that came before. Insidious the Further did not disappoint in the slightest. Not only did it exceed every expectation I could have dreamed of, it also, in my opinion, is one of the scariest houses the event has ever seen, and without a doubt the scariest I have ever personally been through. I have never screamed this much, cried this much, or had my legs shake this much because of an HHN haunted house. Everything about this house was simply flawless. The suspense that built up immediately rounding a corner and seeing a gigantic red door at the end of a long hallway, which seemed to get bigger the closer you got to it. The creepy violin music from the film, the voice of Elise, everything immediately set the tone for what you were about to experience. The scares came fast and frequent with the best scare actors this year's event had to offer. Always in character and easily the most aggressive cast in terms of getting in your face. They also played host to some of the most creative scares I've ever personally seen at the event. Boo holes were completely hidden by darkness, mirrors played tricks with you and betrayed every sense of comfort you attempted to cling to, and in an HHN first, one scare actor to cover 3 boo holes completely hidden by curtains. This house was terrifying every single time. Some of the most interesting scares were the Bride in Black, where Parker Crane, Bride himself, would linger behind hanging bodies, watching you as you passed, only to charge at you in a dead sprint down a hallway and leap at your neck. I could go on for hours about every scare in this house, especially the ones that made me scream like I've never screamed before. However, it would be a crime not to mention the most terrifying sequence, the curtain room. While walking down a candlelit hallway, you would come to a room completely covered in curtains that were placed so perfectly it made it impossible to see any boo holes and predict where the scare was coming from. Before you knew it, the red-faced demon would fling open a curtain and come within inches of you. Another would creepily reach a hand around a corner, one finger at a time, before another later in the room would leap out at you, and before you knew it, you were being attacked from all sides. The true beauty here was having the scare actors up on a pedestal and in charge of 3 angles each. This meant that one actor could follow you through the room and scare you 3 separate times with perfect timing. The finale hallway, which featured all of the demons from the franchise, was also terrifying, but nothing beat that curtain room. As if the scares weren't enough, this has to be one of the most beautiful and detailed sets in the history of the event. The giant red door, the exterior house facade, the rooms in the house, the dead bodies room, the photo room, the asylum, everything was truly breathtaking with so many details from the films that it would leave any fan of the Insidious franchise satisfied. Each area felt unique, right down to the lighting choices and sound design. The dark blue lit asylum contrasting the red-faced demon's red layer. I cannot speak more highly of this house. A true accomplishment from HHN's creative team as well as the nightly cast. Insidious the Further will likely stay in people's memories for years to come, and hopefully influence houses in the future. This house goes down as one of the greatest of all time, and received the very much deserved House of the Year title. While Splatter Cinema was my personal favorite for the year, it's impossible to deny the excellence and perfection that is Insidious the Further. That's it. We covered every scare zone and every house that Halloween Horror Nights 33 had to offer. But before we end this episode, I'd like to take a moment to touch on the only show at the event, and that is Nightmare Fuel Nocturnal Circus. An unpopular opinion, I've never personally been a fan of the Nightmare Fuel shows. While the music is always great, the overly sexual nature of the show truly never appealed to me. However, this year's Nightmare Fuel was actually great. Less sexual than before, which is saying something if you've seen the show. The premise was interesting, and the circus acts, use of pyro, stunt work, and dancing allowed for an extremely energetic and detailed show that matched the energy of the event perfectly. Not to mention, a truly phenomenal soundtrack. While I did enjoy the show this year and wouldn't mind seeing it return, I'm honestly hoping something new is on the horizon. For me personally, it feels like Nightmare Fuel has run its course, and with rumors of the show director moving on to new things within HHN, it seems like now would be the perfect time to do something different. Whether that's a Bill and Ted-esque show, something more along the lines of Jack's Carnival of Carnage, or something completely different, it would really be great to see what the creatives of HHN can come up with if given that challenge. That being said, I'm being very hopeful, and it's very likely that Nightmare Fuel will return once again for HHN 34. But maybe someday we will get to see the next evolution of shows at Halloween Horror Nights. Overall, Halloween Horror Nights 33 resulted in a mediocre year. The budget restrictions and creative issues led to some low lows that were also contrasted by very high highs. There were also a lot of issues with crowds this year. There seemed to be more people than ever before, with insane wait times and streets so crowded it was difficult to walk through. While I'm sure this is a problem Universal enjoys having, some better crowd control and a second show would be a welcome addition. There was also an absurd amount of unsupervised teenagers this year, which had some extremely negative results. I witnessed teens fighting with park staff, climbing over gates and ropes, punching and attacking scare actors, and overall behaving in a manner that led me to fear for the safety of both guests and team members. This likely sounds dramatic, but a supervision rule for those under 18, similar to something that Halloween put into place this past year, would be extremely helpful. I honestly don't think I've ever personally seen this many team members injured due to the behavior of teenagers at the event. But I digress. Through everything, I still loved attending HHN 33, and I can't wait to see what's in store for us this year at Halloween Horror Nights 34. Thank you for listening to You Don't Know Jack, an HHN fancast. This podcast is not affiliated in any way with Universal Orlando Resort or any parent companies. If you enjoyed the journey, feel free to subscribe and leave a review. Until next time, remember that you don't know Jack, never go alone, and I'll see you in the fog.